Airplanes are supposed to represent freedom, the chance to soar above clouds, escape the chaos of the ground, and touch the sky without barriers. But sometimes, even 30,000 feet above the earth, the chains of prejudice follow. On a quiet morning flight bound for New York, a man walked onto the plane dressed in an immaculate suit, his polished shoes clicking against the aisle floor. His expression was calm, reserved, yet undeniably commanding. He was no ordinary traveler. In fact, he was one of the most powerful black CEOs in the country, a man responsible for decisions that shaped industries and moved billions. He had worked his entire life to sit where he was sitting, both in society and, quite literally, in the first-class seat he had just taken. But within minutes, everything changed. As passengers settled in, whispers started. A flight attendant's polite smile stiffened. A white passenger approached, confusion painted on her face. And then, in the most shocking twist of events, the man who had spent decades climbing from poverty into power found himself being asked, told, to leave his first-class seat. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because of a ticketing error. But because someone else, a white passenger, felt uncomfortable seeing him there. The CEO sat frozen. His mind raced. He knew this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something much deeper, something far uglier than anyone wanted to admit. To the flight crew, it was a simple solution. To the passengers watching silently, it was an awkward misunderstanding. But to him, it was a dagger, one he had seen too many times before, sharpened by years of unspoken bias and systemic discrimination. And here, on this aircraft, thousands of feet above the earth, there was no boardroom to defend him, no courtroom to fight for him, no allies to shield him. Just a man in a seat he had rightfully paid for, being told he didn't belong. But what no one knew, not the flight attendants, not the entitled passenger, not even the captain, was who exactly they were humiliating. This was not just any traveler. This was the very man whose company controlled the airline's largest budget contract. And within hours, a single decision made in arrogance and prejudice would threaten to unravel $120 million in deals. It was the kind of moment that starts quietly, almost invisibly, until it explodes, shaking entire industries and exposing the darkest corners of society. So the question is, how does a man who has climbed to the top of the corporate world respond when he's dragged back down, humiliated before strangers, and reminded that even his success can't shield him from racism? And more importantly, what happens when that man decides not to stay silent? Before the incident on that airplane, before the whispers and the humiliation that would spark outrage, there was simply a man living a life most would envy. His name was David Cole. At 50 years old, David stood as one of the most respected CEOs in the global tech and finance sector. He carried the kind of presence that filled boardrooms, tall, polished, calm, with a sharp mind that never seemed to falter under pressure. To most, he was the embodiment of the American dream. A man who had climbed from nothing to sit at the very top. David's story began far from luxury. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, where every corner told the story of resilience. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, while his father, when he wasn't working night shifts, was teaching David the value of discipline, respect, and perseverance. From an early age, David knew the weight of hard work and the sharp sting of being underestimated. He remembered the sideways glances at school when he excelled in math, the quiet disbelief from teachers who seemed surprised that a boy like him could solve problems faster than anyone else in the class. But instead of breaking him, those doubts fueled him. By the time David graduated from college, he had developed a reputation as a brilliant strategist. He rose quickly through corporate ranks, not because opportunities were handed to him, but because he outworked and outthought everyone around him. Every contract he signed, every negotiation he won, and every leadership position he earned was the product of relentless determination. Now, decades later, he led a global corporation with tens of thousands of employees. His name carried weight in industries spanning technology, aviation, and energy. Behind closed doors, CEOs of major airlines knew exactly who David Cole was, because his company controlled one of their most lucrative partnerships, a $120 million annual deal. Yet, despite his achievements, David knew something others often forgot. No matter how much power or wealth he held, he could not outrun the shadow of prejudice. Racism was not something he had escaped by climbing higher, it was something that followed, quiet and insidious, waiting for moments to remind him that in some eyes, he would never belong. Still, David lived his life with grace. He traveled frequently, not just for business but for the causes he believed in. Education initiatives for underprivileged children. Programs to mentor young black entrepreneurs. foundations that provided scholarships for students who came from backgrounds just like his. When he boarded flights, it wasn't unusual for him to be recognized, not by strangers in the cabin, but by executives at the very airlines he traveled with. He had shaken hands with their leaders, sat across from them in negotiations, even signed contracts that helped their company stay afloat during economic downturns. To him, a first-class seat wasn't just comfort, it was a reminder of how far he had come, a space he had earned 1,000 times over. But as David packed his suitcase on that quiet morning, he had no reason to believe this flight would be different. He had just returned from a week-long trip finalizing a deal overseas. Now he was on his way to New York to meet with his board. It was routine, normal, the kind of travel he had done countless times before. And yet, beneath the surface of normalcy, life often hides its sharpest edges. For all the stability David projected, he carried scars that never fully healed. He remembered being stopped at luxury stores by security guards who didn't believe he could afford the suits he bought. He remembered the looks from hotel clerks who double-checked his reservation. He remembered the sting of walking into business meetings only to be mistaken for an assistant instead of the executive who owned the table. Each of those moments was a reminder. No matter how high he climbed, there were those who would try to drag him back down. On that morning, however, David was not thinking of those battles. He was thinking about his family, his responsibilities, and the work that awaited him in New York. He was thinking about progress. The deals signed, the programs funded, the lives changed. But fate had a different lesson prepared. As he arrived at the airport, he was greeted by the usual rhythm of travel: rolling suitcases, boarding passes scanned, and the low hum of tired passengers waiting for the boarding call. Nothing about the day felt unusual. He checked in, greeted a staff member who recognized his name, and walked confidently toward the gate. When boarding was announced, David joined the first-class line. It was a space he knew well, a small symbol of comfort that came with years of hard-earned privilege. He entered the cabin, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and took his seat. A man who had overcome so much, now finally resting before another demanding day. But in that moment of calm, a storm was already brewing. The conflict waiting for him would not come in the form of a corporate rival or a failed business deal. It would not come from market crashes or political battles. No, this conflict would come in the form of something far more personal, far more painful. It would come from the very prejudice he had spent his life rising above, now threatening to strip him of dignity in front of strangers. And the irony was almost cruel. The very airline that depended on his company's partnership, the very industry that courted his contracts, was about to make a decision that would shake not just David's sense of self, but the financial foundation beneath them. David didn't know it yet. The passengers around him didn't know it either. But that quiet morning flight was about to become a stage, one where hidden biases would be laid bare, and where the line between personal humiliation and corporate consequence would vanish in the blink of an eye. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and pressed leather as David settled into his seat. He exhaled, loosening his tie slightly, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of exhaustion after a long week of travel. For a moment, he believed this flight would be uneventful, just a few hours of peace before another grueling day. But peace has a way of being fragile. It began with something subtle, the flicker of unease in the flight attendant's eyes when she glanced at David's boarding pass. He caught it but brushed it aside. He had been here before, both literally in first class and figuratively in that space of doubt where others questioned if he belonged. He ignored it, telling himself this time would be different. Minutes later, as the last passengers boarded, a murmur drifted down the aisle. A white woman, dressed in designer clothes, stopped abruptly in front of David's row. Her brow furrowed and her voice, though quiet, carried the sharp edge of indignation. She looked at the attendant, then at David as if he were an intruder. "This must be a mistake," she said. David pretended not to hear, staring out the window, but his heartbeat quickened. He didn't need to listen. He already knew where this was heading. The words, the posture, the entitlement, they were all too familiar. The attendant hesitated, her polite smile stiffening. Then she leaned toward David, her tone coated in artificial sweetness but heavy with pressure. "Sir, could you please step aside for a moment?" The request was wrapped in courtesy, but David felt the sting beneath it. He turned his head slowly, his jaw tightening. Step aside for what? He had checked in, paid in full, and rightfully claimed a seat. Yet somehow he was the one asked to move. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances, others looking away. The silence was suffocating. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one spoke. David remained seated, his body stiff, his voice steady but low. He simply shook his head. "No. The attendant's expression hardened. She stepped back, whispering to another crew member. Soon, 2 attendants stood over him, their voices louder now, carrying authority instead of courtesy. "Sir, we're asking you to relocate. There's been a seating issue." A seating issue. That's what they called it. But David saw the truth in the woman's expectant eyes, the way she clutched her designer handbag, standing tall, as though reclaiming a space she believed was hers by right. David's chest burned. He wanted to shout, to expose the injustice in that very moment. But he also knew the danger of anger, the stereotypes waiting to be confirmed if he raised his voice. So he stayed silent, gripping the armrest until his knuckles ached. The attendants grew impatient. Their voices sharpened, the illusion of politeness gone. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to involve the captain." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A man in business attire glanced over his newspaper, watching but saying nothing. A young couple exchanged uneasy looks, clearly aware of what was unfolding but unwilling to intervene. The air grew heavier, charged with tension that seemed to press against David's chest. Finally, another attendant arrived, the lead steward carrying the authority of finality. He crouched slightly, speaking slowly as if to a stubborn child. "Sir, it would be best for everyone if you cooperated." Best for everyone. Those words echoed in David's mind. Not best for him, the man who had earned his seat. Not best for fairness or justice. Best for everyone else, everyone except him. Reluctantly, with a slow, deliberate motion, David unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose from his chair, his back straight, his face calm though his insides roared with humiliation. The woman slipped into the seat as if claiming a prize, her smile small but triumphant. David was guided down the aisle, past rows of watching eyes. He felt every stare like a dagger. To some he was invisible, to others a spectacle. But to himself he was a man being stripped of dignity, again. They placed him in business class. The seat was still comfortable, but it wasn't first class. It wasn't what he had purchased. It wasn't what he had earned. It was less. And they expected him to accept less without question. As the plane prepared for takeoff, David sat in silence. Outside the window, the runway blurred into motion. Inside, his thoughts stormed. He replayed every moment, every expression, every word that had reduced him from respected executive to unwanted passenger. And yet, what gnawed at him most was not the seat he lost. It was the truth that no matter how much power, wealth, or influence he carried, one accusation of not belonging could still strip it away. But this time, the humiliation wouldn't vanish into silence. Because what the airline didn't know, what none of those attendants realized, was who David really was. Not just a paying passenger. Not just another traveler. He was the very man whose signature determined whether their airline's $120 million contract lived or died. And in that knowledge David felt a shift. The humiliation burned, yes, but beneath it was steel. A resolve sharper than ever before. The plane lifted off, soaring into the sky. But the storm inside David was just beginning. He was no longer thinking about survival. He was thinking about consequences. And when the world discovered how a multi-billion-dollar airline treated one of its most powerful partners, there would be no undoing what came next. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and indifferent, as if the airplane itself was oblivious to the storm brewing inside. Passengers sipped wine, scrolled through phones, or reclined their seats, pretending not to notice the scene that had just unfolded. But David Cole sat rigid, staring out the window, his reflection blurred by the dim light. Inside, a war raged. Every humiliation of his past clawed its way back to the surface. The time a banker assumed he was applying for a security job instead of a loan. The moment a hotel clerk asked for proof he was truly staying in the presidential suite. The countless boardrooms where he had to prove himself twice over, only to be seen as less. Now here he was again, stripped of dignity in front of strangers, a lifetime of achievements erased by a glance and a judgment. The injustice of it burned like fire in his chest. And yet, beneath that fire was something colder, sharper. Calculation. David knew power wasn't in raising his voice, wasn't in demanding an apology that would never come. Power was in the quiet decisions that determined futures. Power was in contracts, in influence, in money that shifted industries. Power was in the pen he held, the signature that could decide whether this airline thrived or fell. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a leather-bound folder. Inside was the draft of the renewal contract. One that would secure the airline's partnership with his company for another 3 years. One worth $120 million. The irony was almost unbearable. Hours earlier, the airline had been depending on his signature to protect them. Now they had treated him as disposable. David's pulse quickened. He pictured the board meeting awaiting him in New York, where executives would ask if the airline's renewal was secure. He pictured the rival airlines that had begged for a chance at that contract, promising better treatment, better terms. And he pictured the smug satisfaction of the woman who now sat in his first-class seat, sipping champagne as if she had claimed victory. But she hadn't. Because David realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one seat or one flight. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong. Every silent humiliation that went unpunished. Every act of prejudice disguised as policy or procedure. And suddenly the decision crystallized. David would not stay silent. He would not let this moment dissolve into another quiet memory of racism endured. He would act, not with anger but with precision. Hours passed in tense silence until the plane touched down. The moment the wheels hit the runway, David's mind was already ahead. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, reminders about the upcoming meeting. He ignored them, his focus narrowing on the choice he was about to make. As the passengers filed out, David remained calm, but his presence carried a gravity that was impossible to miss. He walked past the first-class cabin, past the woman who reclined in the seat meant for him, past the attendants who had smiled politely while stripping him of dignity. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than words. The airport terminal was a blur. He moved with purpose, his suitcase rolling behind him like a shadow. By the time he reached his car, he had already made the call. Cancel the renewal. His voice was steady, almost cold. The executive on the other end hesitated. Sir, you mean the airline contract? That's... Cancel it, David repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. And just like that, the weight of $120 million shifted. The airline, which had humiliated him without a second thought, was now about to face the consequences of its prejudice. Not tomorrow. Not next year. No. The decision sent shockwaves through the industry. Within hours, rival airlines caught wind of the fallout. Offers poured in, better terms, better service, guarantees of dignity. For them, it was business. For David, it was justice. Still, as he sat in the back seat of his car, the glow of the city lights flickering across the window, David felt the heaviness of what had just happened. His choice wasn't just retaliation, it was a declaration. A message written not in anger but in undeniable action. Racism carries a cost. Yet the story didn't end there. Because as the news spread, so did the whispers. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began to speak. Someone had recorded it, a grainy video of the confrontation, the attendants asking David to move, the smug satisfaction on the woman's face. The video made its way online, sparking outrage. Comments flooded in, stories from others who had faced the same quiet humiliations. The world was watching and the airline could not hide. What began as a single act of prejudice had erupted into something far larger. It was no longer just about one CEO or one flight. It was about systemic injustice exposed for millions to see. And David, once humiliated in silence, now stood at the center of a storm he had chosen to ignite. The world wanted to know, would he speak publicly? Would he confront the airline? Would he use his platform to call out the injustice? The questions swirled, demanding answers. And as David prepared to step into the boardroom, into the spotlight, into history, he carried with him a calm that only comes when you know the truth is on your side. This was no longer a story of humiliation. It was a story of reckoning. And the reckoning had only just begun. The news spread faster than turbulence across an open sky. By the time David stepped into his New York boardroom, the incident had already begun to ripple outward. Headlines captured the story: Airline faces $120 million fallout after CEO's discrimination incident. The viral video played on repeat across social media feeds, grainy but clear enough to expose the humiliation he endured. Millions watched. Millions reacted. The airline scrambled. Executives issued half-hearted apologies, citing miscommunication and policy confusion. But the world had seen enough. The footage told a story that no press release could spin away. For once, silence was not an option. David didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The power of his response lay not in loud words, but in decisive action. By freezing the contract, he reminded them, and the world, that racism is not just immoral, it is costly. It corrodes trust, destroys reputations, and dismantles empires built on arrogance. Still, beneath the headlines and corporate fallout, David felt the weight of what had happened. He thought of the silent passengers on that plane, people who had witnessed injustice but looked away. He thought of the woman who believed her comfort outweighed his dignity. He thought of the flight attendants, whose smiles hardened into authority when they chose to protect prejudice over fairness. And most of all, he thought of himself, sitting in that seat, reminded in one cruel moment that no amount of success could fully shield him from racism. Yet, within that pain there was clarity. David realized that what had happened wasn't about one man or one airline. It was about a system, centuries deep, that continues to deny people their humanity. His story was just one among millions. Stories of black men and women questioned in stores, doubted in classrooms, profiled on streets, silenced in workplaces. His humiliation was a reflection of a much larger truth, that progress is not immunity and wealth is not protection. The impact of the incident stretched beyond contracts and headlines. Activists seized on the moment, calling for accountability in the airline industry and beyond. Employees of the company began sharing their own experiences, many confessing they had faced subtle racism in their workplaces for years. The video became a mirror, forcing people to confront the biases they preferred to ignore. And for countless viewers online, the story struck a personal chord. Some saw their own lives reflected in David's silence on that plane, his clenched fists, his forced composure. Others, who had never faced such prejudice, were forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Would they have spoken up? Would they have defended him? Would they have even noticed? That was the real power of the story, not the contract, not the money, but the reckoning it forced. David knew his decision had consequences. He knew some would call it harsh, others excessive. But he also knew this: staying silent would have cost even more. Not just for him but for everyone who looked like him, who lived under the same shadow of doubt, who needed to see that injustice has a price. As the days passed, the airline tried to repair the damage. They reached out privately, pleading for reconsideration. They offered compensation, promises of diversity initiatives, carefully worded statements. But David remained firm. He wasn't interested in apologies crafted by lawyers. He wanted change. Real change. And until they proved it, his company's contract remained frozen. Behind the strength of his decision was a simple truth: racism thrives in silence, but it crumbles under accountability. For David, the incident became more than a personal wound, it became a platform. He spoke at conferences about systemic bias in corporate spaces. He funded new programs to expose and combat discrimination in industries where it often hides behind polite smiles and professional titles. And he reminded every young black professional he mentored that their worth was not defined by the ignorance of others. But perhaps the most important impact was this: millions of people who heard David's story began to see the world differently. They saw how racism doesn't always shout. It whispers in policies, hides in smiles, and disguises itself as misunderstanding. They saw how injustice doesn't just hurt feelings, it destroys dignity, limits opportunity, and demands accountability. And maybe, just maybe, some of them decided to act differently the next time they saw injustice unfolding. Because that's the question this story leaves behind. When you see someone being stripped of their dignity, whether on a plane, in a store, at work, or in school, will you stay silent or will you stand? David's silence in that moment of humiliation was not weakness, it was strategy. But silence from those around him? That was complicity. And that is where change begins. Not in the aftermath but in the moment itself, when the choice to speak or to stay quiet determines the world we create. So, as you finish this story, ask yourself, if you had been on that plane sitting just a few rows away, what would you have done? And more importantly, what will you do the next time racism appears not 30,000 feet in the air but right in front of you? Because injustice doesn't end with contracts, headlines, or apologies. It ends when ordinary people refuse to look away. And until that day comes, the cost of racism will continue to rise, one seat, one life, one industry at a time.